program. Is it not working now?
There you go. Okay.
It's because of that song. Welcome everyone to tonight's program, Camp Fortunate. Presented by the history legend, Steve Moorehouse. Steve's wife, Sharon, was my 5th grade history teacher, now my friend.
Can you talk into the mic?
Put it into the mic.
It won't work.
Turn this on. Try it again.
Okay. Steve's wife, Sharon, was my 5th grade history teacher, now friend. And with her help, I was able to give Steve the proper introduction. Steve's love for Lewis and Clark began in middle school back in Boston, where he had a history teacher that introduced him to the expedition. During his job as a park ranger at Lassen Park in California, he studied the indigenous people, the Yahi people, now extinct. Steve's interest in Lewis and Clark reenactment came after meeting a Shoshone man by the name of Leo Arrowhite while working in Idaho. He joined Leo and other tribe members and came to Clark's Canyon, where they would reenact where Clark met the Shoshone and Sacagawea meeting her people. After interviews with Leo and researching through books, Steve's interest of Lewis and Clark turned into a passion. Steve managed the Bureau of Reclamations at Clark Canyon Reservoir for almost 30 years, including a section on the Lewis and Clark Trail. The book Images of America, Beaverhead County, was published by Steve and the Beaverhead County Museum in 2008. I use Steve's book for every project I do. Thank you. It's a great book. He continues to do reenactment and history educational presentations around this area. After our presentation tonight, we will have a question and answer, the raffle drawing, followed by refreshments in the depot foyer. And looking ahead into next month, on February 20th, we will be hosting Leroy Friel, author of Exploring Montana's Pioneer Mountains. Leroy will be bringing with him a slideshow that you outdoor enthusiasts will not want to miss. He will be signing books, as Debbie from the bookstore will be here that night to sell them. And mark your calendars for Wednesday, March 19th, because that is our 75th anniversary. We will be having a dinner being held at the Lewis and Clark Room. Along with dinner, there will be a live auction, a slideshow, and a recording of the original director, Alfreda Woodside, walking us through the grand opening of the museum in 1950. We also booked a May program for Thursday, May 8th, Miss Mary Jane Bradbury. She was here last year about this time and told her story of Charlie Russell's wife, Nancy Russell. She is returning to our theater as she has expressed that she loves it. And she's going to present A Mother's Journey, the life of Lucy Meriwether Lewis, Marks, mother of Meriwether Lewis. And now, I present to you Steve Moorehouse in Camp Fortunate.
Thank you. Can you still hear me back there? Okay. This is an honor for me to share with you what little bit of knowledge I know. And I think I know everybody here. I see friends and family and people that I've met along the trail and here in town. And the butterflies go away as I get into the program. So I wanna take you below Beaverhead Rock, the north side downstream. And we want to connect up with the expedition there as they're coming up. They're always going against the current. When they leave St. Louis, they're going against the current. They get on the Missouri and they're going against the current all the way to the headwaters. That is what Jefferson mandated them to do, is to find the source of the Missouri, hoping that they will be able to portage and get on the Columbia River drainage and find a northwest passage. So we find them 220 years ago. They're downstream from Beaverhead Rock. It's the 8th of August. And they left on the 8th of April. They left the Mandan villages near Bismarck, North Dakota. 4 months to the day. And they haven't seen anybody. Isn't that amazing? All the way across Montana, halfway across North Dakota. They have not made contact nor seen anyone. However, they have been seen by the Native Americans, but they do not reveal themselves. In fact, below Whitehall, Clark walks on shore and finds a set of footprints. And whoever it was climbed up on a knoll and obviously looked into their camp that night. So they're getting anxious. They know that they're going to run out of water. They're having a hard time getting up what they call the Jefferson River. Today we call it the Beaverhead. But they called it the Jefferson River all the way to Clark Canyon Dam. And it's getting shallow. The men are in the water pulling the canoes with a rope or standing in them with poles and pushing. The poles have a metal tip on the end of them. When they lose those, Lewis finds gigs that he had brought along, and they substitute the gigs for the metal tips that they have lost. One man gets in the back of the canoe, one man gets into the front. They're standing up. And the one in back pushes while the one in front sets his pole. And they have to do this in unison, so they don't slide backwards. And then the one in front pushes while the one in back sets his pole. And that's what they're doing. When you read the journals and they mention poling, that is what they're doing. The canoes are hollowed out logs. I had one of my own. And I kept it down at Clark Canyon Reservoir until I was ready to go on the trail. And when I brought it in, it was in the water, tied up at the dock. When I brought it in, Williams Feed weighed it for me, 2,000 pounds. It soaked up that much water. So here's these guys. They're down to buckskins, like I'm dressed. They soak their deer skins in the river at night, and one skin wrapped around your leg makes a legging. They save all of the deer skins. They bring what meat they can back to camp, but they never leave a deer skin. And when the hunters are ahead of the expedition, they hang the deer skins on the willows alongside the river. Sergeant Gass kept a diary along with Lewis and Clark, and 2 others kept a diary. Gass says the men are nearly naked now. They're in the river wearing nothing but a breechcloth. Lewis had these made before they left on the expedition. And it goes between your legs, and you know what a breechcloth is. So that's all they're wearing. They want to put on warm, dry buckskins when they get off the river. And they're barefoot as well. And I learned the hard way, getting in the river with my moccasins. They are really slippery, especially on the smooth rocks. And you're better to go barefoot. So the men are complaining about sore feet and being tired. They're in the cold water, and they're dragging these canoes in places where it's so shallow, it's nothing but a riffle. The captains, especially Lewis, is getting very concerned. And he knows that they're going to run out of water, and they're going to have to go to horses. They're banking everything on getting horses. And that is one of the reasons they have Sacagawea with them and Charbonneau, is to interpret with the Shoshones to get horses. And just downstream from Beaverhead Rock, she looks up and tells the captains that rock outcropping on the right side of the river, my people call the Beaver's Head, because it looks like a beaver, to me it does too, swimming across the valley, heading east. And so the captains are feeling a little more reassured. She said, we will find my people on this river, and if not, we will find them on the river on the other side of the mountain. The salmon, or the Limhi River flowing into the salmon. So Lewis decides to go ahead. Clark has a boil on his ankle that's making it painful for him to walk. It should have been his turn, and he says so in the journal. They alternate going ahead. But because Clark is in so much pain from this boil on his ankle, Lewis is going to go ahead. And Lewis selects 3 individuals to go with him. George Dreyer, who was hired as an interpreter, he is very proficient in Indian Sign Language. So he can talk to anybody. He's half Indian and half French. And he learned sign language from his mother. Then he selects John Fields, who, with his brother Reuben, were chosen by Clark to come on the expedition in what they call the 9 young men from Kentucky, and they're all woodsmen. They can handle themselves. The Fields brothers, you don't mess with. Today, they would be compared to Hell's Angels. And when you read about them, nobody messes with them. And they both are very proficient hunters. And John and George Dreyer have hunted together for the last year. And they get along together and they hunt really well. And then he selects Hugh McNeil. And I don't know a lot about him, but you know that he had to have been a very good soldier, or Lewis wouldn't bother with him at all. And so they leave the slow-moving canoes downstream from Beaverhead Rock, and they go from there all the way to Dillon on the first day. And then they continue on. They go from Dillon to Horse Prairie, a 30-mile day. Before Lewis left, he told Clark, we need horses, and if I have to be gone for a month, I'll be gone for a month. They've never left. They've never gone ahead more than 1 or 2 days. That's how desperate this man is. So they continue on that 30-mile day. They get within 2 miles of Grant, and they've had a long day, and they stop and make camp. They get up in the morning, they go through Grant. They're a couple of miles west of Grant, and they've lost the Indian road. They're following horse tracks, they're following travois tracks, and it kind of faded out there in the grass. It also had rained that night and hailed on them, and they have no tent. So Lewis tells Dreyer to go to the right, Shields to go to the left, and he keeps McNeil with him. And they're walking spread out, going west through the Horse Prairie Valley. And Lewis periodically stops and takes out his spyglass, and he's looking ahead. And when he stops to look ahead and glass ahead, the 2 men that are spread out on the flanks get ahead of him. Lewis spots a man on a horse, and he's looking through the spyglass, and he says that this guy is dressed different than any of the Indian tribes that they have encountered. And so he surmises that this is a Shoshone. And so his hopes get up, and he continues to walk towards this guy sitting on the horse. And when he gets within 200 yards, the man on the horse stops, and he's looking at the 2 flankers, and he's getting nervous. Lewis cannot get their attention, and he's getting upset. He had told them, put your hat on the muzzle of your weapon, hold it up. If you find the Indian road, which they haven't found, and so they continue to get ahead, the man on the horse is looking at these 2 men, and they're carrying weapons, they're carrying guns, and Lewis decides to leave his rifle with McNeil. He has a blanket, Army issue wool blanket, and he gets within 100 yards of this man on the horse, who's very nervous. And Lewis throws his blanket up in the air 3 times, and lets it come down to the ground. He holds up beads and looking glass. That's a sign that he come and sit on the blanket. Come and sit and we will trade. He also had asked Sacagawea, what is the name for white man? She didn't have one. They don't have a name because they've never met any. She says Tababone, which means enemy. So Lewis strips up his sleeve. His hands and his face, he said, are deeply tanned, but his arm is white because he wears long sleeve all the time. And he points to his white skin, and he holds up his arm and he goes, Tababone, Tababone. And the man on the horse whips his horse, turns around, and is gone. And Lewis is afraid he's going to go warn the village that there's strangers coming and they are carrying guns, and the village will pack up and leave. He calls the two men back, and he can't help himself. He chastises them for not paying attention. And he thinks that because of them, because they didn't stop, that was the reason. Maybe if they had stopped and had come back, things might have worked out. They try to follow the horse tracks, and they lose them. They stop at the mouth of the canyon going up to Limhi Pass that night. The next morning, the 12th of August, they climb up to the top of Limhi Pass and come to that spring that's there in the campground. You used to be able to go up and drink from it, but now it's fenced off. When I first came here in 1980, I loved to go up there and drink that ice cold water. It tasted so good. Just below that spring, down the hill, a mile or so, McNeil straddled that little rivulet and thanked God he had lived to see the headwaters of the mighty Missouri River. And they believe that was the headwaters. Actually, it is down in the Centennial is where the actual headwaters is at. They climb to the top and they look west. And Lewis realizes we're not going to portage the canoes over this. And he sees more mountains, and they're snow-capped. And he knows that they have to have horses, absolutely. Otherwise, they're going to be turning back. They can't spend the winter there. So he goes down the other side, comes to a spring, and he believes, and he is right, that he's drinking water that flows into the Columbia River eventually. The next morning, he continues on. They're following the Indian Road again. They got back on it. And as he's going along, they're dropping down into little ravines and then coming up and dropping down and coming up. They come up and there's an older woman with two young girls, and they're digging roots. And they come up on them so quickly, one girl runs off. The older woman can't run, so she bows her head in submission. And Lewis, using sign language that Dreyer had taught him, says, I come in peace. This is a person, this is go, and this is come, and this is peace. And he takes her by the hand, and he says, I come in peace. He gives her beads, gives her a looking glass, scissors, an awl, and he asks her to have the other girl come back so that she won't alarm the village. Somebody else on a ridge over saw this and is already headed to the village, unbeknownst to them. He gives them beads. He also has learned to paint their cheeks with red vermilion, and he paints red vermilion on their cheeks. Sacagawea told him this was a sign of peace, a sign of friendship. So he asked her, you take me many lodges, the village. And she says, yes. And then he asks her another question, you take me to man who rises above others, chief. And she says, yes. And so they head out. McNeil has got a pole that the day before he had put a small American flag on, and he's walking with this pole with the American flag, and the three women, and they're following the Indian road to the village. They're along the Limhi River. The village is actually on the other side of the town of Tendoy, or the little grocery store at Tendoy. And they're walking along, and the village has already been alarmed. And here comes 50 mounted warriors with war paint, ready to fight and defend their village. The woman goes around Lewis and goes out in front of these warriors, galloping full speed towards them. And she stops them. And she says, look what they gave me. Look at my cheeks. They come in peace. And so the chief gets off, comes up to Lewis. Lewis has handed his gun to McNeil. And with the left arm, he puts his arm over Lewis's shoulder and his cheek against Lewis's cheek. And he says, aha, hey, it is good. The right hand is for fighting. And it's only the white people that extend the right hand. And not a gesture of peace. All 50 mounted warriors get off their horse, and they all come up and hug Lewis. And Lewis writes in his journal, I'm rather tired of their fraternal hug. And my face is covered with their grease. He is astute to the customs. Before he left, he had the blacksmith at Harper's Ferry, the armory, U.S. Armory, and he made a pipe for Lewis. And the bowl is from an old rifle barrel. After the program, if you want to come up, you'll see riflings inside the bowl. And they sit down. And Lewis, Virginia boy, has some fine Virginia tobacco. And they smoke. I've done the pipe ceremony many a time as I traveled the Lewis and Clark Trail. You don't inhale, you take it into your cheeks, and then you blow it into your hands, and you cleanse yourself. Then you take another puff, and you slowly exhale and let it go out up to the sky as you say a prayer. Before you hand it to the next person, you point to the four corners of the earth. Okay? Here's how most of the Native Americans do that. And then hand it. I just pointed to the four corners, and then I hand it off to the next person. They get up and they go to the village, and they come into the village, and the chief has skins laid down, and they sit down, and the chief says, we take off our moccasins when we smoke. It's a sign that if you're not sincere, may you walk barefoot for the rest of your life. And so everybody removes their moccasins, and the chief gets out his pipe. It's an older style pipe. You must hold it upright. Lewis describes this to a T. He's a very detailed man. And that's how I was able to get a reproduction. He even describes inside the pipe that there is a little disc that you put in there before you put the tobacco in. It keeps it from plugging the hole. And so you would smoke this way, and then I don't know how they would point to the four corners of the earth. Maybe they didn't. And then you hand this to the next person. Lewis says it's a green, translucent material, talc. We mine it. And so this is a reproduction of Kamiawa pipe. Lewis inquired requires from them information on getting on the river and going down the river. That's what they really want to do. They want to make canoes and travel by water. The chief tells them, no, you can't. There's cliffs along the river. He's talking about the salmon now. And there's waterfalls, there's rapids, there's swirling water. You can't. Today it's known as the river of no return. I have been rafting it for 36 years. And there's no way you can get a hollowed out log down through there. So Lewis is not sure if that's totally true or not, you know. Well, you know, they might be exaggerating. Drew has gone out and looked at the horse herd, comes back and tells Clark, they've got 600 to 700 horses. Wow, great. Lewis tells them that he would like to have them come with him back to the two forks of the Jefferson. And that location is halfway between the dam and the Big Island. Horse Prairie comes in from the west and hits the island is a singular mountain in the middle of the plain. And Red Rock comes from the south. They both hit and go around and then come together. And that's the location of Camp Fortunate. When Lewis got there, he knew the canoes, if they could get there, couldn't go beyond there. So he wrote a note to Clark and tied it to a dead willow. He had tied a note to Clark at the mouth of the Big Hole on a green willow, and the beaver chewed it down. And Clark went 9 miles up the Big Hole before they could stop him. And he said he never saw that note. So Lewis makes sure that it's tied to a dead willow. He asks the chief, I want you to come with me. Let's go to the two forks. It's going to take 2 days at least to get back over there. It's about 40 miles. So the chief not really wanting to go. In fact, the chief's hair has been burned off short in mourning for family members that have died. And many of the other men have their hair singed short because they were over there and the Hidatsa raiding party from over the Mandan villages had caught them there and had killed many of their people. So they're really hesitant to go with this stranger back to the same area. And Lewis says, you know, it's dishonorable in our culture to deceive people that way. And we would never do that. And the chief finally says, okay, I'm not afraid to die. I will go with you. And Lewis says, my fellow captain has red hair, and we have a man who is black. And, oh, yeah, we've got a girl from your tribe also with us. And there's another young girl. Sacagawea is around 17, 18 years old. And this other young girl hears about that. She's same age. And when they do form up, she gets to go with them. And it is co-ed. She's not the only woman. Lewis lingers for an extra day in the village to give Clark time to get up the river. He knows that they're having a tough time and they're going slow. So when they do get together and they ride out, there's about 60 of them. The first night away from the village, half of them get nervous and ride back. And Lewis is getting nervous too. He knows that if he can't hold their confidence, that they stand to lose everything. They ride on towards the two forks. Some of the young men are starting to tell the chief, hey, this is a setup, you know. He's not telling the truth. Look ahead. And it's open, and they can look ahead and there's no smoke coming from the two forks. And they're about a mile and a half or more from the two forks. And so they stop. And the chief decides to give Lewis a gift. He's wearing one of these. It's an otter skin with 150 white ermine and abalone shell down the tail. Lewis later writes, this is his most elegant piece of clothing. He actually, when he gets back, he hires an artist to paint a picture of him. He calls this a tippet. The name tippet comes from the clergy when they put a shroud over their shoulders. Lewis understands that what the chief is doing is making him look like a Shoshone. So Lewis takes his hat, and they had many different styles of hats, and he gives it to the chief to wear. And Lewis says, with my hair disheveled and my face and hands brown and my outer shirt of the Indian kind and the tippet, I need nothing more to make me look like an Indian. But they're not anxious to jump on their horses and continue on Lewis is so desperate, he does something unbecoming of a military man, and this is the only time he ever does that. He takes his rifle, state of the art, he is rifled in the barrel. He got the first 15 of these from Harper's Ferry. He hands it to the chief. It's loaded. And he tells the chief, if I'm lying to you and this is a trap, shoot me with my own gun. Boy, that's a sign of desperation. He tells the 3 men with him, do the same thing. We need to get them to the Two Forks. So they ride in to the Two Forks. Of course, there's nobody there. And Lewis is not sure what to do right now. He left a note for Clark. He tells Drewyer, go ahead, get that note so that everyone can see you getting it, and bring it to me, and then interpret as I read it. Drewyer interprets to the chief as Lewis reads, this note is from my fellow captain. This is from Clark. And he says to wait here, that they're coming up the river. Well, the sun is starting to set, so we need to make a fire and make camp. Lewis just dug a hole. I hope he can get out of it. Well, the Shoshones that stayed there go in and hide themselves that night in the brush. The chief and 2 of his sub-chiefs sleep with Lewis around the campfire that night. And Lewis says he didn't get much sleep. Yeah. He doesn't know where Clark is at. So in the morning, he asked Drewyer to ride down the river and find Clark. The chief has a couple of his men saying, go with that guy, and then one of you come back and tell me what you find. So Drewyer rides down the river about 2 miles, and he comes upon Sacagawea and her husband, and they're walking ahead of the canoes because the canoes are going slow. And she sees the Indians with Drewyer. She knows their dress, obviously. It's been 5 years since she was kidnapped over in the Three Forks area. She is so excited, she is beside herself. She turns and looks at Clark, and she's sucking her fingers and dancing up and down. And she's holding this 7-month-old baby. And she is just, oh man, so excited. Drewyer tells Clark, I need to get you, Sacagawea and the interpreter, I need to get you up to the Two Forks, to the camp where the rest of the Shoshones are with Lewis. And so they go ahead. Of course, one of the Indians comes riding back to the Two Forks, and Lewis, for a second there, is going, oh my God, something happened. But he tells the chief that, yes, there's more people coming up the river, and they're dragging canoes, and what he said was true. As they come into camp, Clark is greeted by the chief, and he ties 6 abalone shells to Clark's red hair. These are very valuable. They're traded from the people on the West Coast. If you're not familiar with abalones, come up after the program and I'll show you where it comes from. I used to dive for these. Sacagawea comes, and as she starts to walk into the camp, this other young girl, same age as she is, comes running out of the group, and the 2 women hug and start crying. And Lewis says, what's happening? And she said, this is my girlfriend. We grew up together. And we were both captured over in the Three Forks area. We were about 12 at the time. She escaped and made her way back to the village. And I didn't. Now I'm married to this French-Canadian trapper. So they were reunited there. They sit down to negotiate for horses and the reason why they're there. And the Indians had taken willows and made a conical shade, put skins on it. During the day, it's hot, and the nights are cold. So they sit down. In fact, Clark sits on a white rope, and they asked Sacagawea to come up and help with the interpretation. Sitting next to Lewis and Clark is Private LeBage. Yeah, French. Bilingual, French-English. Next to LeBage is Charbonneau, who is also French. And he speaks Hidatsa, which his wife has had to learn. And so Lewis and Clark tell LeBage. LeBage tells Charbonneau. Charbonneau tells his wife in Hidatsa. So it goes from English to French, French to Hidatsa, and she tells the chief. And they negotiate back and forth this way. When all of a sudden she jumps up, takes her blanket, which she's wrapping around the baby and carrying. She had a cradle board and lost it in a flash flood at Great Falls. And now the baby's wrapped in a blanket. That's why you see on a Sacagawea dollar, you see the baby is wrapped in a blanket because she has lost her cradle board at Great Falls. She throws her blanket over the chief and starts crying. And the chief is moved, but he is doing everything he can to hold his composure. And the captains ask, what is going on now? And she says, this is my brother. He thought I was dead. If you're ever in a strange land and you need horses in the worst way, just show up with the chief's long-lost sister. You can have all the horses you want. They do. They get 29 horses and a guide, and they're able to continue on with their journey. And you know the rest of the story. I have a little afterthought. I did a reenactment of that meeting at the Two Forks, and I made lots of trips down to Fort Hall. I had no training in diplomacy working with Native Americans. And I finally got them to agree to come up and join me and a group of mountain men from Idaho that I had gotten to know. And what happened was, I was sitting there at the table in frustration after many meetings, and they said, you know, we get invited to come and do a drum ceremony, and then they say, okay, thank you, and that's it. And then we look over, and they've got a potluck going on that we're not even invited to. And so I said, I'm not inviting you. I'm asking you to be a co-partner with me. And then everything changed. They said, yeah, we'll be a partner with you. And I said, if I eat, you eat. And if we have a potluck, you will eat with us. And we did that after the reenactment. And so I got them to come up. We did 6 years. The last one was with the bicentennial in August of 2005. That was the biggest one that we ever had. And we camped there where the reenactment was, at the mouth of Horse Prairie Creek. And around the campfire, the elders, mostly Leo Arrowhite Sr., would open up a little bit. And he said, you know, it wasn't her brother. He said, we have some oral history, but not a lot. He said, we don't know her real name. And she said that, or he said, that was not her brother the way your culture thinks of it. In our culture, brother is brother. First cousins are called brothers, and second cousins are called brothers. And in our culture, you don't marry your brother. And they said, in our oral history, he was a cousin, not brother as your culture thinks. So I asked, well, what was her Shoshone name? And he said, we don't really know. she found out at the Two Forks that her family had been killed. And she found out that two brothers, now they might have been brothers, they might have been first cousins or second cousins, but two brothers survived. The rest of her family is gone. And the nephew from her oldest sister, who was killed, was also alive and in the village, and she adopted him right then. And another thing that I found out is they do not have a word in their culture for orphan, because there is no such thing as an orphan. No child is left behind. Every child is taken, if something happens to the parents, the child is taken in by somebody else. And they don't have a word for orphan, and they don't understand why we have orphans. Why do you have orphans? I asked about her name, and he said that they don't know, but he also said that there are a few things that we like to keep for ourselves and not give everything away. And other tribes along the Lewis and Clark Trail actually said the same thing. We will tell you a lot of stuff, but there's a few things that we want to keep for ourselves. And he said, we know that her name is a Hidatsa name, and it's pronounced Sakaga Wea. And that name is still in the Hidatsa language. It means bird, woman. Sakaga Wea. Wea is woman. He said, let me put it this way. You have a daughter. Yeah, I do. Brooke. He said, okay, if somebody kidnaps your daughter and they kill a couple of your family members, you don't see Brooke for 5 years. And the people that kidnapped her call her Elizabeth. Now, when she comes back to you, are you calling her Elizabeth? And I said, no, of course not. You know, I named her Brooke. I call her Brooke. And he goes, yeah, we know that Sacagawea is the anglicized version of Sacagawea, and they're the enemy. So it's a dig when we say Sacagawea. For us, it's a dig against the kidnappers. And that's how they explained it to me. And I said, well, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If I'm in Dillon, I'm in Shoshone country, it's Sacagawea. If I'm in North Dakota, Sacagawea. And it is actually spelt in the journals with G's. But when Lewis dies, Clark is left to get the journals edited. Sergeant Gass had his edited and produced a book before the captains. It really upset Lewis that Gass had done that ahead of them. But Lewis dies in 1809, and Clark hires a Philadelphia lawyer to edit the journal, and for some reason, at least he used red ink, so we know what he marked up. He drew red lines through all the G's and changed them to C's. And that's where the Sacagawea comes from. But in the journals, of course, they're phonetic spellers. I thought I spelled bad. They're worse than me. So they spell her name a dozen different ways, but it's always with G's. And that's where the controversy from the name originated, was from Nicholas Biddle, who edited the journals. Nicholas Biddle also interviewed Clark to clarify parts of the journal. And those letters and that interview is published also. It's not a book that you can readily go and find. Being on the trail, I was able to get a copy. There's actually 2 volumes. And I get the rest of the story, the Camp Fortunate story, from the interview from Clark, where he goes into more detail about the reunion there at the Two Forks. It was Clark, the cartographer, that wrote in the apex where the 2 rivers come together. He wrote Fortunate Camp, and that's where that comes from. So I will end my program, and I have stuff up here. I forgot in my nervousness. Lewis handed out 3 of the smaller Jefferson medals to the main chief and 2 sub-chiefs. So he handed out 3 of these. They were on ribbons. I put blue beads because that was their favorite. And if you haven't seen the Jefferson medal, I'm going to pass it around. It is hollow. They took a piece of silver as thin as Kleenex and pressed it on it, and that wears off right away. So you won't see these with the silver. This is the size of the large medal, and they were saving some of these for the bigger chiefs and the bigger tribes. They also carried, so I'll hand these around. Thank you. And I'll have somebody in the back collect them. They also had with them George Washington medals. And a lot of people don't realize that. Most people are familiar with the Jefferson Peace Medal. Washington had these made, and he didn't want his likeness put on the medal like Jefferson did. And he said, I'll be criticized by the British, saying, oh yeah, you broke away from us and then set up your own monarchy. So he had an Englishman and a Native American in the middle of a field, and then on the back, the eagle, which is turned sideways. later turned it. And with olive branch and arrows. And this is the Washington medal. It took so long to get these. Washington was out of office by the time they came. And so Jefferson said, I don't know what else to do with them. Take all those old Washington medals and hand them out to the chiefs. So that's where this one came from. I'll pass that around. Let's open it up to questions. I may have to have Morgan or Chris help me out if I can't hear.
You mentioned that they had 600 or 700 horses. You mentioned that there were 600 or 700 horses, the Shoshones.
You mentioned there was 600 to 700 Shoshone horses, correct?
Yes, 600 to 700 horses.
Does he know anything about the history of how they got that many horses, the previous 100 years?
Do you know how they got that many horses?
They got horses around 1700. And the first horses they stole from the Spanish. And then probably raiding, trading, although they said they never stole any horses, they only captured them. So, yeah, and Drew also mentioned that there were 20 mules in that group, yeah. 40 colts. He saw at least 40 colts. I bet there was more than that.
Steve, I wanted to talk just for a second about that Sacagawea thing and why here in Dillon we say Sacagawea. Back in the Centennial days, the local historian of the Lewis and Clark expedition was Laura Tolman Scott, and there was much discussion even then about, what her name was, and she said in her correspondence, look, we're from Dillon, we're gonna call it Sacagawea with a J. So that's why we down here use that term. But here's another thing to think about. Clark is from Virginia with a G that sounds like a J. And there are a lot of G's, hard G's, that sound like J's in our language. And who's to say how that may have ended up? That's what I could. There we go.
Thank you for the presentation. Do you have any way of estimating, or was there any record of a description of the flows that they were encountering heading upstream on the Beav or the Jefferson?
He wants to know like what the flow rate was of the river back then, or if there was any way to have indication of what the flow rate was of the rivers.
They had with them a log line, and it was Clark that was measuring the current. And I've only seen one along the trail. It's a piece of wood and a long cord with markers every every so many feet. And they would throw that out and time it. 'Cause they had, Lewis and Clark both carried pocket watches. And they would time it to measure the current, but I don't recall what the current was. One of the things that amazed Lewis while he was in the Horse Prairie Valley, he said that he had never seen and didn't know of a river like the Missouri and the Jefferson, where you could travel by canoe. So he called it navigable. And he had no way of measuring elevation from the mouth of the Missouri to Grant, Montana. They have gained 5,000 feet, roughly. But he didn't know that. He didn't have a way of measuring elevation. And he said it was so subtle that you don't realize how high you get. And he said, with the snow on top of the higher mountains around the Horse Prairie Valley, that he must have gained a lot of elevation, but he didn't know how much.
Thanks for being today. Is this on?
No.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay, there you go. Yeah, thanks for being here today. And as far as like sunshots, surveying to identify their longitude and latitude, did they have some kind of instrumentation along to help them with that?
Did they have instrumentation to get
Oh,
latitude and
yeah,
longitude?
I got you. Clark was a cartographer. On his belt, he carried this. It was one of the compasses that come up after the program. This is an exact replica of the compass that Clark carried. The original is at Smithsonian. And when I went there and identified myself, who I was, the manager took me to that case and opened it up and put it in my hands. And I'm going, I'm not worthy. Said, well, you're just gonna hold it momentarily so you can say you held Clark's compass. And then they put it back in. But the one thing that I was able to get was the leather case that it was in. So I took every measurement I could and photographs of it. And there was a man in Helena who made the reproduction of this leather case, along with Clark's portmanteau, which is what he carried his uniforms in. This was common. This was a suitcase. It has one handle. I saw one that had a handle on both ends, but that's not authentic. It has one handle so you can stand it up while you pack the horse, and then pick it up and tie it on. They had a sextant, and they also had a artificial horizon And what Lewis would do was pour mercury inside the artificial horizon. It has a mirror. I've never used one. It has a mirror. And so he could get, in the mountains, he could get an artificial horizon. And he would use that sextant to do that. He also had a chronometer, which I didn't bring tonight. I was trying to keep the baggage down. He had a chronometer that was set to Greenwich time, and the chronometer faithfully had to be wound every day. So he knew where high noon was in Greenwich, England, and where he was here in Dillon. He would wait and get high noon here, and then by the time distance gave him the longitude, and then he got his latitude from the North Star by measuring the angle that it's at. As you go north, then the North Star gets higher.
And then, how did they keep track of distance?
How did they keep track of distance?
Clark had a chain, a surveying chain, but it wasn't practical, so they counted paces. And in the journals, I've converted it to feet and yards, and they use paces. You know, they said when I got within 100 paces, their pace was 3 feet. So, and I convert that for the audience into feet and yards. But it's, if you look at Lewis's, or Clark rather, not Lewis, Clark, he has, and you'll have to come up, he has all of his angles and distance, degrees and distance, but he was never able to close it, which I'm not a surveyor, but surveyors close off what they are measuring. And I've had surveyors tell me he's pretty damn close. And he was the one that was shooting that. And besides this belt compass, he had one, a bigger one, that sat on a tripod.
How often did he do his total survey plates with instruments?
How often did he use his surveying instruments?
Every day that he could, yeah. This is probably, of all of the equipment they carried, this little thing, to me, is the most important thing that they had. What do you think it is?
Fire starter.
Pen and ink. It was the writingest expedition. These are replicas, size and shape, everything, except they're paper. of the journal. And Jefferson had purchased a lot of these before they left. And you can, when you come up to take a look at the little tiny fine print. Guess who? Who was type A? Lewis. And then you see the other captain, big, free-flowing. So I think that pen and ink set is the most important thing, or I wouldn't be here without these. And there's still a lot to learn. When you come up, this is an exact copy of the map that they carried with them. Jefferson procured that, gave that to them. Of course, it was folded up, so it went compact. Those are all fold lines. And you'll see in the middle, there is nothing. And that's where they are. Nothing here. They knew the coastline on both coasts. This is an estimation of the Rocky Mountains.
Steve? You know, there was, speaking of the journals, there was a very important journal entry entered by Lewis at Camp Fortunate on his birthday. When he, if you want to just, if you want to just.
The book in the car, Ron.
Well, what he said is that this is my, you know, I think it was his
This is my 31st
birthday, and as of probably half the number of years that the Lord will allot me, but as of yet I have accomplished nothing. And heretofore I dedicate myself basically to make something of my life. And then he wrote no more for about half the rest of the journey.
Yes. Thank you, Ron. I left the book. I meant to read that, and I left the book. In my nervousness, I left the book in the car. And unfortunately, he only, after writing that, he only lives 4 more years. And in my opinion, it was a mistake to make him governor. You should have left him alone so that he could have edited the journal. He could have put together all of the plant collections that he had done. And I'm sure he could have gone back through the journals and embellished some stuff. But Jefferson felt obligated to make him governor of Louisiana Territory. And he was so far away from Congress, he had enemies in Congress who were upset with the amount of money that he was spending. And he died on the Natchez Trace trying to go back to defend himself with Congress. Didn't make it. Any other questions?